Hello and welcome to today and this week's Daily Bible Study. My name's Geoffrey Farrer and I'm Minister of Barnes, Putney and Roehampton Methodist Churches in the Richmond and Hounslow Circuit, and it's lovely to be with you once again. I know these are very strange and difficult times, and I do hope that you and your loved ones are as well as possible. We're continuing our series of daily Bible studies that we started before Easter in this strange time, and we're taking a different theme each week. Last week we looked at the resurrection appearances in the New Testament, and this week we're looking at the theme of adoption in the Bible. Now that might seem a strange theme at any time, but especially in this time when we're thinking so much about coronavirus. Now I have a special interest in this subject, in that in a few weeks' time, as many of you know, I will be taking adoption leave and will be starting a new family here when we adopt a little boy. And so it's a journey we've been on, my partner and I have been on for the last 5 years, more or less. And so we've done a lot of reading and we've done a lot of studying and we've learnt a great deal in that time. And they always say that you should talk and preach about what you know. So I thought I would talk about adoption because I happen to know a lot about that and because it's at the forefront of my mind a lot of the time at present. But more than that, it's also an important subject, and even at this time we need to be thinking about other things as well. And it's an important subject, and a subject that has implications because of the coronavirus, because we know sadly that more children are being taken into care at this time of great stress. But also it's a subject that is of great interest to the Bible and to Christians generally. When we started looking at this subject, when I started looking at this subject, I was amazed by how many verses and how many stories there are about adoption within the scripture. And I've actually had to trim this week down. We could have done several more sessions. And a lot of this week's sessions have been inspired by this book, Home for Good, written by Krish and Miriam Kandiar. And they are members of the Evangelical Alliance, and they have established, Krish has established his own charity, Home for Good, which is promoting adoption and fostering. And they have adopted and fostered a number of children, and they are passionate about the subject, and they are passionate that Christians should be intimately involved with fostering and adoption. And so a lot of this week's material comes from this book, and beneath you in the description book there's a link to that book and more information about that book, and there's also links to a number of adoption and fostering charities as well, in case you feel inspired this week. And there's also details of all the different texts we're looking at this week and a link to the biblical material. Now that's quite a long introduction to today's study, but just one final thing. And that is to say that adoption and fostering, and any time we're looking at issues around children or around families, promotes, it's a very difficult subject. It's not a subject that we can look at dispassionately, for example, like nuclear weapons or perhaps ecology. It's something that goes to the very heart of us all, and everybody watching this will have had their own experiences in childhood and of families, and their own experiences of difficult situations. So if this subject is just too painful or too raw for you for whatever reason, then please just step aside and wait until next week when we're doing something different. But if it does provoke very difficult memories, or if there's anything you would like to email me about, then please do so. I hope, though, that you will find it, however you're coming to this topic, of interest, and it may challenge you to think differently about some of the texts and some of our scriptures. Where to begin then? Well, we begin right at the beginning of the Bible with Exodus chapter 2, and the birth of Moses. And this is a fairly familiar story, but I think Krish Kandiar, this is where he starts his studies, gives a new perspective on this story. So just a reminder of where we are. So we're in Exodus 2, The second book of what we call of the Old Testament, of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books at the beginning of our Old Testament, the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures. And we've had the stories of the foundation stories in Genesis, the stories of the patriarchs, of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and then Joseph and his brothers. And Joseph and his brothers, of course, end up in Egypt, and all seems to be going well. But then at the beginning of Exodus, we read that the Pharaoh of Egypt has become displeased with the number of Hebrews there are in his country, and he's made them all slaves. And in fact, he has determined that there are too many even of them as slaves, and that he is determined to kill all the children. And we read about 2 incredible midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who managed to save many Hebrew children. But it's into this context of terror and brutality that Moses is born. And so I pick up at Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. Now a young man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the banks of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, I'm sure that's a story that many of us are familiar with from Sunday school, and we might have drawn little pictures of it or even made a little Moses basket. And we can think of this as a beautiful little story fit for children. But actually, of course, there's much more to it than that. And Krish Kandiah, he writes in his book, when the Bible first mentions fostering and adoption, it is in the context of a desperate mother with no other option to save her family but to abandon her child. And this story of Moses really is a microcosm for all that is to happen next in the Pentateuch. The child cries out and is heard and saved. God's people cry out in Egypt in slavery because they are suffering. God hears them and saves them. And there's a wonderful link here with an earlier story, because that word that's used for basket, what we would call a Moses basket, that word for basket, appears only once before only once more in the Hebrew Scriptures. The word is tiba or teba in Hebrew, and the other time it's used is to describe another rudderless boat, and that is Noah's Ark. So the ark and the basket use the same word, both vessels used to save God's people from destruction. And I love that idea of the adoption of Moses being an ark, and adoption itself being an ark. And there are 2 key points for me coming to this story. And there's so much, of course, we could talk about more in detail about this. But in the context of adoption, there are just 2 points I would like to make. Firstly, that adoption is driven by desperation. Before this, we're told all about the terrible violence that is being wrought upon God's people as slaves in Egypt. And sadly, we know now that these are no fairy stories, and we know too many stories about brutal dictators terrorizing their people and that inevitably it is children and women and the innocents who suffer most. And when we look across the world, the orphans we find are most often the products of war and terror, disease and famine. They come out of desperate situations. And in the UK, in our context, there can be a temptation to see adoption and orphans through a very romantic lens. And there are so many orphans in fiction: Oliver Twist, Batman, Harry Potter, Annie, and many, many more. But the sad fact is, that children who are put forward for fostering and adoption in the UK come from terrible situations, just like Moses. They come because there is no other choice. There is no other option for them. And they have seen and experienced truly terrible things. In our own journey of adoption, we have read a lot and met a lot of adopters and spoken to a lot of social workers, and we have heard a lot of stories from children. And I think the thing that horrified us the most was just how bad things have to get before a child is taken away from their parents and before they're put up for adoption. As one writer, one adoptive mother put it, these children have not just seen a bit of neglect or a bit of abuse, they have actually been tortured in many cases. And I'm sorry to have to talk about these things in such brutal detail, especially at this time when we're all facing so much bad news. But as Christians, we are called to be as innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents. We need to know what is happening in our world and not shield our eyes from it because it's too uncomfortable. Where's the good news? Well, the good news is the second point I'd like to make from this. And that is that it is not God's will that these children should suffer. And as I said, there are so many texts in the Bible about orphans, and in all cases they are saying that God cares about these children and desperately wants them to receive love and care. And they seem to have a special place in God's heart. Later in Exodus in chapter 22, God says, "You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry." We think of the cry of Moses that attracted Pharaoh's daughter in the bulrushes. God heard the cries of that child. He heard the cries of the Egyptians suffering in slavery, and he hears those crying out in our care system today. And the cause of adopted children, of orphans and children in need, has inspired Christians like Krish and Miriam today, and countless other Christians over the last 2,000 years, to do something. And this story for me is very powerfully saying that we are called to help children in need as best we can, to hear their cry and to share with God in their care. That's enough for today. There's lots more to be said. But I just ask you to reflect upon that story and to think about how and if anything that I've said and what Krish and other commentators have said helps us see that story of Moses in a different light. Perhaps when we take it out of the Sunday school book and put it into our serious thinking pile. I'd like you to think, whose cries do we not hear in our society? In our Bible, whom do we not hear speaking enough? I'm just going to close today, as every day, with a very short prayer. Loving God, these are difficult and hard subjects to tackle. Help us, we pray, as your people, to hear the cries of those in need, and especially of children in need, and help us to be moved to act and to respond. and to share in your love and concern for them. Bless our reading of your holy word this day and always. Amen. As I say, these are hard subjects, so do be kind to yourself, and I do hope these are not too hard, especially at these times. I'll be back again tomorrow with the next part of Moses' story, and we continue to reflect on that theme of adoption in the Bible. Until then, stay safe and stay well.